Hi, I'm Bonnie Wood, and I'm presenting today Milan's Early Years, Captain Jacob Shook in Shookville. Today, we honor Jacob Shook, an ordinary man who became a leader and philanthropist and made a difference in Milan's early years. Captain Jacob Shook, he made history. Through research and primary sources, from deeds to military minutes to journals and maps, Jacob's story and that of Shookville and Milan in the first half of the 19th century emerged. Let's begin at the beginning, Jacob's beginning. We can view Jacob's baptismal record above the red triangle. On the 28th of November in 1779, Jacob was born to George Shook and Christina Pultz. He was the second of 4 sons, a close family in every sense. 3 Shook brothers, Jacob, Peter, and George, set up their farms a stone's throw away from each other. Thus, this area became Shookville. Their brother John had a farm near Shook's Pond, where the Red Hook Golf Club is now located. By viewing this record of Jacob's baptism thoroughly and knowing that Jacob married Catherine, daughter of John Stickle and Elizabeth Bean, who were also witnesses at his baptism, we must ask this question. Was a union between Jacob and Catherine arranged at his birth? From 1803 to 1809, 2 sons and 3 daughters were born to the young couple. While his family grew, Jacob's role in the community expanded. He was raised on a farm, yet it was his willingness to serve that made him a significant figure in Milan history. From 1811 to 1816, serving in Lieutenant Colonel Martin Herman's Dutchess County Regiment. Local citizen, Jacob Shook became Captain Jacob Shook. This document is from the military minutes of the state of New York. During the years he served in the militia, 3 more daughters and a son were born to the family. Returning home to his Shookville farm from his service in the Dutchess County Militia, Jacob was one of the signers on the 1817 proposal to form Milan. Although the original proposal was modified before Milan became a town in 1818, Jacob played an important role. Note the red triangle to view a more recent map depicting the patent locations. In 1817, the family added a son, for a final tally of 4 sons and 6 daughters. When Stephen Thorne became Milan's first supervisor in 1818, Jacob Shook, near the red triangle for Shookville, was appointed Milan's first overseer of the poor, where he displayed his compassion for the less fortunate, providing for the needs of the poor, including women, children, and those with a mental illness, fell under the auspices of the town and ultimately the county. Jacob was the ideal candidate for this position. Jacob quickly moved from overseer of the poor to Milan's second supervisor from 1821 to 1823, where he served the young town with a population of 1,797. Of that total, 358 were designated as farmers. These figures are for the year 1824 and are thus approximate. Throughout all of his other responsibilities, Jacob continued to farm. 200 years after the founding of Milan, stone walls and stone foundations remain on land once owned by one of the Shook brothers. In the early 18th century, the land of hills and stones, now called Milan, was populated by determined, hardworking farmers clearing the fields. This foundation for a barn and the surrounding stone walls were built by William Coon. 22 of his acres he purchased from Peter Shook for $857 in 1850, and 11 of the acres were purchased from Jacob Shook by the owner prior to William Coon for $580 in 1842. In addition to farming, Jacob owned a general store and a distillery. Jacob's brother George added a tannery to his farm business. What's a historic general store without a post office? Jacob Shook served as Shookville's only postmaster from December 31st, 1827 to September 29th, 1835. While a successful Milan businessman, Jacob's impact on the community expanded as he and his wife, Catherine Stickle Shook, donated land for the purpose of building a church. The red triangles are near their names. This excerpt from a scan of the original deed reads, "This indenture, made the 13th day of December in year of our Lord, 1833, between Jacob Shook of the town of Milan, county of Dutchess, and state of New York, and Catherine, his wife, of the first part, and Peter Shook, Luther Webster, Philip Mink, Henry Fulton, George Shook, and John Shook of the second part, representing the church." Note the community members who joined together to support this initiative. The Shookville Church. Top center, 1834. We have Reverend Winter stands in front of the center window. Top right, 1901. Burton Coon explained, quote, "Fred Green gave me a framed picture of old Shookville Church that had been his mother's. It was taken by Reverend Joseph P. Carley when he was pastor at Milan and Shookville in 1901. Mr. Carley's wife and two children, Paul and Nina, are standing by the east door. Good preacher and good photographer. He died March 28, 1919, and is buried at Cooks Falls, New York." On the bottom right, this was taken in 1919. Photos of the church and the parsonage were taken by highly esteemed photographer Harry Coutant. 1960, unknown photographer, donated by Webster Coon. And the two images on the left, I took those images to document the leaning south wall and the falling stones as they are in 2022. And let's go back to an 1862 article in the Red Hook Weekly Journal for a moment. This was at the occasion of the funeral of Peter Shook. And it is reported there and was commented on by the Reverend at his funeral that Peter Shook was considered, quote, "one of the pioneers of Methodism in this section of the country." Additional primary sources documenting the Shookville Methodist Church include this photo of the 1834 marker attached beneath the center window of the church. It reads, "This church, dedicated June 7th, 1834, was erected by Jacob and Peter Shook for the benefit of the German Reform and Methodist denominations." The marker is now on display at the Milan Town Hall and can be viewed by visiting the lower level near the entrance to Milan, New York history. This newspaper clipping adds the detail that preaching will take place on Sunday, June 8th, 1834. Preaching on various days through the week, love feasts, camp meetings, and conventions continued through the 19th century and the first 2 decades of the 20th century, though there were some years of sporadic activity. Community members attending a love feast might expect to share a meal, hear scripture, sing hymns, and share testimony. The camp meetings were also popular and might draw several communities to spend a week together. Some residents attended various church activities more than one day a week. The church was really a central location for those in the, not just in Shookville, but also went further afield than just the immediate area. The Shookville and Row Methodist churches in Milan joined together for a church picnic at Upton Lake about 1905. The land donated by Jacob and his wife, Catherine, included a cemetery. The first burial at the Shookville Cemetery was Jonathan Ingalls, who died on the 2nd of November in 1833. Co-founder Peter Shook's gravestone stands at the front of the photo, and his wife, Maria Bonesteel, is buried to his left, beneath a stone that now lies flat. Gertrude Myers was the final burial. She died on the 8th of December, 1921. The north wall of the Shookville Church is in the background. 20 years earlier, in 1818, Jacob was Milan's first overseer of the poor. In 1838, he served as superintendent of the overseers of the poor and reported to the state assembly. Let's examine this primary document. As superintendent of the poor, the reference to, quote, "and justice and humanity demands that some other provision be made for them," unquote, demonstrates Jacob's continued service to the less fortunate. The year 1839 was life-changing for 60-year-old Jacob and marked an upcoming change for Shookville. Jacob purchased nearly 1,000 acres in Macomb County, Michigan, which was founded in 1818. He settled in the towns marked in red on the west side of Lake St. Clair. And we have there Clinton, Mount Clemens, Harrison, and of course you see the notation there for Macomb County. With all of his accomplishments and commitment to the growth of Milan, Jacob went west. Michigan had achieved statehood in 1837. Why? Why go west? For the land? In 1830, plentiful farmland in Michigan sold for $1.50 an acre, since the United States government had taken land from tribal nations and was selling it at cheap prices to pioneers from the East Coast. By 1840, prices rose to $6 to $10 an acre. The opening of the Erie Canal in 1825 provided an easier route for settlers, leaving New York and heading to Michigan. Perhaps the practice of primogeniture played a role. Jacob was the second son. Not only farmers considered going west, with settlement came the need to establish businesses and support the growth of towns. The red triangle marks the Jacob Shook estate, where Jacob and Catherine settled on a farm 1 mile out of Mount Clemens in 1841. He had purchased private claim 172, including Fulton and Irwin farms in Harrison. At the age of 61, supportive wife, mother, and philanthropist Catherine Stickles Shook died in Clinton Township, far from Dutchess County, where she left behind Stickle and Beam relations. The red triangle marks her mark on the deed for the land donation to build the Shookville Church and create the cemetery. Less than a month after Catherine's death, in his mid-60s, Jacob was elected to the U.S. House of Representatives. Jacob of Shookville, significant figure in the early years of Milan, New York, became a prominent political figure in Michigan. And we can see here that Jacob was a Democrat, that his place of residence was Harrison, the county was Macomb, and he was elected in 1846 and sworn in January of 1847. The 1860 census lists Jacob Shook as retired and living on the family farm with his daughter Betsy Teets and her family. Captain Jacob Shook died on the 11th of April in 1862 at the age of 82. He joined his wife Catherine and other family members when he was laid to rest at the Clinton Grove Cemetery in Clinton Township in the county of Macomb, Michigan. How did the move to Michigan impact the Shook family and other community members? Which families were divided? Names known in Milan and Michigan include Shook, Stickle, Beam, Phelps, and Dietrich. This might look like a very busy slide, and it certainly is, but we're going to focus on the Greens. In the first generation, we have George and Christina Shook as the parents, and then their children. We have George, who was buried in Indiana. And I'll just mention Peter because he is buried here in the Shookville Cemetery in Milan. He did not go to live in Michigan. And then, of course, we know that Jacob did, Jacob and Catherine did. And the two sons that went with them were Robert and Theron. They accompanied the parents west. Another son died in Montreal, Canada. That was Edward. The Fraser name is common in Dutchess County and was in Michigan. See the red triangle on the 1860 census in Macomb County, Michigan? Dutchess County native Betty Fraser was listed with the extended Shook family. So if we go across that line, we see that she was 40, female, Black, servant, born in New York. She was also listed with the family on the 1850 and 1870 census. She was with the family thus for at least 20 years, and I am still researching to find her final resting place. Now we come to the son-in-laws. Jacob's son-in-law, John I. Traver, marked by a red triangle on the left, prominent in New York, private secretary to a Livingston, a merchant and office holder in Michigan Register of Deeds for 4 years, and for many years a supervisor. And Henry Teets on the right, marked by a red triangle on the top right, was supervisor of Harrison Township for 3 years and Register of Deeds of the county for 4 years. Below that, you can see Caroline. Caroline married David. And Caroline is buried in Michigan with the family. If you look directly beneath that, you see that that is the same David that who is listed as a son of Peter's. So the daughter of Jacob and Catherine, Caroline, married the son of his brother Peter, Peter and Maria. So David was in Michigan, but he went further west and died in Colorado. And we're going to learn a little bit more about David on the next slides. And also Peter Lauren, his brother Peter Lauren, died in Michigan, and we will find out more details about that. This map of the 11th Lighthouse District in Michigan helps us visualize where the Shook family settled. 1 marks a spot for Mount Clemens. You will note that the number 1 is in the inset and the full map. Jacob Shook and his extended family settled in this area west of Lake St. Clair. Number 2 marks a spot for Point O' Bark. Let's examine the blue letter signed by David Shook. David is writing from Mount Clemens about his lighthouse building contract in 1854. And that, of course, is a government-financed contract. The story of Peter's sons, Peter Lauren and Catherine Doyle Shook at Point O' Bark, is coming up on the next slide. Number 3 marks the spot where Jeff Shook, 5th great-grandson of Peter Shook and president of the Michigan Lighthouse Conservancy, now owns the Port Sanilac Lighthouse. And number 4 marks a spot for Fort Gratiot, first lighthouse built in the future state of Michigan. And you can see there that you have the river that goes down to Lake St. Clair. Lake St. Clair is so small compared to Lake Huron. And finally, the name Doyle, which was very common in the early 1800s in Shookville. In Port Hope, yes, Hope, Michigan, in March 1847, Peter Lawrence Shook, son of Shookville Church co-founder Peter, became the first lighthouse keeper at Point O'Bark Lighthouse. Whether Jacob, who was in the U.S. House of Representatives at the time, had any part in his nephew's appointment is unknown. His nephew's or his son-in-law's appointments is unknown. Tragically, Peter died when his boat capsized in March 1849. His wife, Catherine Doyle Shook, with 8 children to care for, became Michigan's first female lighthouse keeper. Much as the lighthouse is a symbol of hope for sailors on the sea, the Shookville Church provided comfort and support for 19th and early 20th century community members. And Captain Jacob Shook, through his service, was a beacon of hope in Shookville and Milan in the early years. In light of his service in New York, it is not surprising that he continued to serve his family and community in Michigan and became a significant figure in Macomb County's history as well. Captain Jacob Shook. He made history. I'd like to acknowledge Al Labruto, supervisor, Vicki Labruto, historian, both of the town of Milan, Fred Battenfeld, secretary, sexton, Rock City Cemetery Association, the Pomeroy Foundation, who funded the historical marker that now stands in front of the Shookville Cemetery on Shookville Road in Milan. And Jeff Shook, president of the Michigan Lighthouse Conservancy. He is a 5th great-grandson of Peter Shook. Thank you all for viewing, and we hope that you will check out Milan, New York history.